Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
It felt for a long time that the revolution had gone away, and since '91 the subject academically had somewhat languished. Many people had abandoned Soviet studies, as it used to be called, and fled into other areas, because it seemed that that intellectual sort of heritage had completely disappeared forever. Some sort of, I would call them Soviet apologists, had reinvented themselves in other forms, some still around today using the same ideas and same emotional impulses to support Putin. Others had chosen other subjects and so on. As a result of teaching and thinking about the subject, I thought, well, there is something to be said if we look again at the Russian Revolution. Russia is, much less of a superpower. It's definitely a regional power and a menacing one to its neighbouring states as we see today. And it seemed to me that it was a good opportunity to look at the Russian Revolution in the longue durée as an arc, because it is now genuinely history despite its afterlife, and it is genuinely a completed cycle despite its afterlife. If you look at it as one arc, then some things come into relief. Most books, most short books on the Russian Revolution, they circle around the years 1917. That always struck me as an artificial sort of construct. My own big book on the Russian Revolution, A People's Tragedy, went back to 1891, and that's when I decided to start this, because it does seem to me that the famine crisis of that year, which mobilized and politicized Russian society against the autocracy, was the beginning of a revolutionary crisis. You had writers like Tolstoy and Chekhov giving up their literary careers temporarily to help in the relief campaign. You had professionals, Chekhov himself, a doctor, throwing themselves into their work to help the people. You had Zemstvas and other local bodies calling for more representation in national government. You had political parties forming. You had Marxism emerging, arguably for the first time in Russia in the 1890s, as a way of trying to understand how it could have been that Russia's fiscal policies and program of industrialization had led to such impoverishment of the ordinary people. So populism is now almost supplanted by Marxism as the dominant way of thinking about modernization and the crises that brings about. So that's when I had no doubt about starting it, but it also seemed to me that actually, in many ways, the Russian Revolution doesn't end until 1991, and it would be useful to look at that arc as one, okay, neat, but actually intellectually cogent cycle of exactly 100 years. And that's not often done. I mean, if you look at the books written on the Russian Revolution, I can't actually find one that goes all the way to 91 as a revolution. Historians tend to, and political scientists tend to think of the Russian Revolution as a phase followed by the regime, a stable regime. And of course, in the 70s and 80s and 90s, people thought of the revolution as something that would have to come to an end at some point, just as we think of the French Revolution as something that came to an end, I don't know, Thermidor, Napoleon's accession to be emperor, whatever, whenever you want to call it, there's a point at which you think a revolution ends and then it becomes the consolidation of a new system. And that's the way people tended to think about the Soviet Union and the Russian Revolution. So some books, like my own on A People's Tragedy, ended 1924 when Lenin dies. Others ended earlier, 1921, when the Bolsheviks emerged victorious from the Civil War. Some people ended it in 1927 with the defeat of the left opposition and Trotsky. Others in 1929 with the launching of the five-year plan, or 1932 with the idea that Soviet industrialization was the outcome of the Russian Revolution, and you're then into a phase you call the Soviet system, which is stable. And let's not forget, as late as 1987, 8, 9, it looked quite stable. People thought it was going to last. Certainly when I started studying Russian history in the early 1980s, it looked like this was forever, until it was gone. So that was the sort of thinking that determined the writing of the Russian Revolution as one phase, and then there's a system. And I don't think people then looked at it again because everyone was so bored and tired of it all. But as I say, throwing it into the relief of 100 years, trying to understand the revolution of that arc as a revolution, as a project, a utopian project, a project in human engineering, a project in social reconstruction, a project in literally thinking you're going to have a global revolution and a workers' paradise. That is the ideology, and it's an ideology taken seriously by the leaders. That ideology, in revolutionary form, continues right through till 91, I would argue. Of course they lose belief. Of course the population becomes increasingly cynical. But if you look at it as a revolution and you try and understand the motives of the Soviet leaders as still furthering the revolution, still carrying on Lenin's work, then some of their policies and thinking becomes clearer, I think. Within that cycle, I think I would draw your attention to what I in the book call 3 general